We have a response panel coming up. I'm really excited to introduce you to Professor Andy Rumbach, who's our newest faculty member. He has a PhD from Cornell University.
Wow, that's a lot. Thank you.
A lot of his research has focused on disaster resilience, and so Andy's going to take over moderating this panel.
Thank you, and thank you, Jim and Wendy. Well, as Carl said, I'm Andy Rumbach. I'm a assistant professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. I don't think I can do nearly as good of a job with the body language that Carl has to signal that people should stay on time. So I hope he stays up here and continues to. I'm much worse about letting things run over. So we have three respondents today. Unfortunately, the fourth could not be with us. But the first is George Atta, who's the principal and chief community planner for Group 70. And George has the area of specialization in cultural and natural resources and also in hazard mitigation and planning.
Thank you. I guess our main job is to respond to the two keynote speakers that we just had. And we're in the recovery section of, I guess, today's program. And I think the first thing that Jim said that I completely concur with is that, I come from a private planning perspective, although I have been in the public sector with the city and county before. And the importance of having a pre-disaster plan in place before the disaster occurs. I mean, it seems like a pretty straightforward thing, but it's a very important thing because it's very difficult to do any kind of a planning while the disaster is occurring. So clearly, I mean, that's stating the obvious, but I think a lot of people don't do it. So I think it needs to be stated over and over again, and I completely concur about that. The other thing that I guess our second speaker spoke about the economic recovery thing. I think an important distinction in economic recovery is in a way, there's two kinds of economies going on. Right immediately after the disaster, there's a recovery economy, which often has FEMA funding. It has private insurance funding. So for a certain length of time, the functioning economy of the area is actually based on money that comes from insurance and governmental sources. And then after that, when that runs out, there's an economy that actually is an economy, hopefully, that if you've done a good job of recovery, what they call the normalcy period is you're back to a normal economy when the FEMA funding has run out. And making that transition is often very difficult. As Wendy mentioned, 40% of the businesses never return. So essentially, if 40% of your economy dries up, you come back to both a market and a capital source that's reduced by 40%. And that's a completely different kind of economy, and so that has to be recognized if you're really going to plan properly for a post-disaster recovery. So I think those are very key, important things that needs to be stated in that recovery phase. One thing I did want to add is that throughout this whole conference so far, is that I think people have touched on the importance of social capital, but I don't think it's been highlighted. I think it's a very important part about recovery that hasn't been highlighted. I think you see dramatic differences between what happened in Minneapolis and Sendai, Japan, about how the population reacted after the disaster. And both in Minneapolis and in Sendai or in the Tohoku tsunamis, those communities have a lot of social capital, obviously. So after the disaster, they come together and they behave in ways that are quite different than some other communities. And so if your community has a lot of social capital, they will react much better and recover, I think, much better than communities that have less of it. And I think part of both pre-disaster and post-disaster planning should put a lot more focus on what it takes to be prepared, not just from a planning disaster response standpoint, and this is another part that was sort of touched on, when you talk about capacity building, There's lots of talk about equipment, training, and those are important, but I think there's also an important part about social capital building capacity, that if it's in place before the disaster, the community will respond a lot better and a lot more effectively, and I think it actually will carry through better in the recovery phase if your community has social capital. It's an element of disaster planning that in some ways is a little hard to put your hand around, but it is an important factor in it, and you can see it in communities that will riot and loot after a disaster as opposed to communities that come together and help each other out. I think that's an important thing that should be included in any of these discussions.
Thank you, George. And so next we have James Spencer, who's a professor in, well, 2 departments at UH, one political science as well as urban and regional planning. And Jim, he's also the director of the Globalization Research Center and has done some pretty extensive research in East Asia, including research on flooding in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. So, Jim?
I won't purport to be an expert in post-disaster recovery, but a number of things that I've worked on probably relate to this notion of bouncing forward instead of backwards. And it's interesting that George kind of ended with a comment about whether there's looting or not after any kind of disaster. And actually, that's something that I have a lot of interest in, both in terms of sort of personal experience. I grew up in New York City, and when I was about 10 years old, the blackout of 1977 happened. And for those of you who are aware of it, there's a lot of looting that went on, people breaking storefronts, stealing TVs, and all this kind of stuff. The same exact event of a blackout happened, I think, 2004, 2005 maybe. And everything was hunky-dory, everybody was patting each other on the backs and helping each other out and all this kind of stuff. And it had to do everything to do with the nature of the changing economy, the changing society of New York City, and had nothing to do with the actual disaster itself. That was the same. And so that's sort of what my focus is on, is that background socio-economy of any given, in particular, city, as sort of the core capacities that enable you to actually move forward rather than backwards. So what I want to do is to basically take a couple of seconds to respond to some broad concepts that I saw in the 2 presentations. And the first one I want to touch on is replace versus innovate. And that's a central question that anybody has to ask, right? Small businesses, 40% of them go out of business anyway, or higher percentage of that go out of business anyway within the first couple of years. So the question of who comes back becomes really important. And in some ways, a disaster may be just the excuse that a lot of small business owners were waiting for, because it puts a nail in the coffin of something that may have been struggling along. And in some ways, if you look at the Great Recession that we're kind of currently part of, you can interpret the jobless recovery as part of that. Is a lot of businesses underwent severe financial stress, and they got rid of a lot of employees, and they realized, well, maybe we didn't really need those employees. A lot of stuff can be done online, can be automated, and so in the recovery process, they're not hiring them back. And that's something that's an important concept to understand, is that change is happening, and that the nature of investments in that small business private sector, when they're coming back, have to be strategic. They shouldn't really be universal. They should be strategic based on what the opportunities are for the immediate recovery and the long-term kind of development trajectory. Okay, the second component, or the second issue that I want to touch on is this notion of compressed timelines. And, if you've ever been in any kind of disaster, from, the smallest thing of, spilled milk to the biggest thing like New Orleans, on-the-spot decision-making is really important. What's important in making a good on-the-spot decision is understanding the spill-on implications of it. And I use the example of some work that I did when I was in Los Angeles on the post-1992 riot policy responses in the city of Los Angeles. So if any of you remember the 1992, there were a lot of race riots in Los Angeles. There was a lot of kind of looting. There was a lot of violence, some deaths, some very public beatings, a lot of property destruction. And what happened was that the city and the state felt there was a really important need to respond, and there was a lot of actually burned out buildings and this kind of thing. But as much as anything else, there was a political pressure to respond, right? Both from the local Los Angeles constituencies, the state constituencies, and the national constituencies. What that meant was that the nature of the policy response was going to be a political debate. It was going to have a lot of political implications. What unfortunately ended up happening was that the response was to set aside a certain area of the city of Los Angeles that would be targeted for investment, that would be targeted for certain types of tax credits and business support systems. Now, when you have that high-profile policy response driven by these pressures, that time constraint, you have a lot of other people coming to the table. It's very visible. And so every neighborhood that had even just a little bit of damage then went to their legislative representative and said, we need to be part of this. We need to be part of this kind of tax credit place-based program. So what ended up happening was that the whole city and region of Los Angeles was basically benefiting from all these kinds of tax credits and investment incentives, which is great for the city of Los Angeles, but not particularly targeted on those places that were affected the most. So we have to remember that when you have these kinds of compressed timelines, the politics can play in very importantly and inequitably if that on-the-spot decision-making isn't sensitive to those dynamics. In terms of the planning field as a whole, I think one of the things that we saw was that there's a real emphasis on, having good planning prior to any event, and as well as having good planning processes and relationships in the moment. And this is something that I think can't be emphasized enough. And what I want to say is that specifically the planning of the built environment, right? Because disasters and major events, whether they be social or natural and physical, are that they provide opportunities for big investments. And if you think about the 1989 earthquake in San Francisco, right? What happened? The Embarcadero Freeway pancaked, flattened out. Well, what was the most natural thing to do would have been to kind of rebuild it. But in fact, actually, they didn't. They chose not to. And it was probably one of the best planning decisions that's ever been made in sort of the history of American planning. Because if you go down to the Embarcadero now, it's an extremely vibrant community that has lots and lots of small businesses, lots of tourist development, lots of kind of corporate and small and medium-scale businesses, lots of pedestrian foot traffic. And the best planning choice was about the built environment. It was about the choice not to invest in rebuilding that freeway, but to invest in the physical infrastructure to upgrade the docks, to upgrade the physical accessibility to that neighborhood. And that was a very important decision that had everything to do with planning the physical environment. The final thing that I want to say is that it touches on this notion that there's this role of planning prior to disaster. And I think that's entirely right. I also think that it's important to think about the institutions of implementation that are in existence prior to any kinds of policies and responses to those disasters. And what I would say is that rather than creating new institutions, one should bolster the existing institutions that are out there, both state and federal level, in ways that are equitable and targeted towards the areas that need the most response. I talked a little bit earlier about sort of these high-profile types of efforts, and an example is something also after New Orleans, right? So the Bush administration said, what are we going to do? Everybody said we have to do something. The Gulf Economic Opportunity Zone, I think is what it was called. It turned out, for that same political process, it turned out to have, not just New Orleans, it had Louisiana, it had Mississippi, it had Alabama. It was just a huge swath of land, and I haven't seen any formal evaluations of the impact of this kind of, opportunity zone, but I suspect that its impacts were fairly diffuse. To me, what has always been a better strategy was to work through the existing structures of service delivery, whether it be through the social service delivery, through in the case of New Orleans itself, a lot of the social service earned income tax credit for the working poor, 10% temporary assistance to needy families, to poor families. Those kinds of efforts can transfer a lot of resources and expertise down to very targeted levels without the political pressures of having a big program that once it's a public debate is going to get into that democratic political process. So anyway, those are just some thoughts that are responses to these broad concepts that none of which I have any dispute with, but I just want to get a little bit more specific about them.
Thank you, Jim. And so last we have McKenna Kaufman. McKenna is an associate professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. She really has expertise in environmental economic modeling, but she also has done some interesting work on disaster recovery, doing comparative disaster recovery in Hawaii after Iniki. So, McKenna?
Thanks, Andy. So I want to take a step back a little bit and think, really focus on what Dr. Schwab was this concept of normalcy. What is returning to normalcy, and how do we really think about that idea? Is it getting back to the economy as it was before, or getting to something else that it would have been without the disaster event? And I also want to take a more long-term perspective. So there have been lots of studies, many of which Dr. Schwab cited, on the short-term effects of disaster. A lot of these studies, the sort of burgeoning understanding of what are the effects of disaster in the aftermath, occur pretty near, within a few years of disaster occurring. And there's a good reason for this. It's one, there's interest in that disaster event at that point in time. And second, it's easier to attribute an impact to the disaster event itself near term, right? As time goes on, how do you actually attribute, well, this impact was because of disaster that occurred 10 years ago? It becomes much more difficult to do. And so in this sort of burgeoning understanding of what are the short-term impacts of disaster, it's really all over the place. Right? The theories lead us all over the map. Anywhere from Dr. Schwab focused on in terms of disaster events can actually increase economic activity to it can decrease economic activity. Right? So the increase in economic activity, there's sort of two ways to think about it. One is just as Jim pointed out, this sort of Schumpeterian creative destruction argument, right? That not only do you rebuild, but you rebuild bigger and better, right? That it creates innovation. A second way to take that, and I think it really is case specific, is more about the accounting techniques itself. Oftentimes people have really critiqued this disaster increases activity argument based on the way we simply do accounting. It's the practice to do accounting based on the flows of economic activity rather than the stocks. So if the flows at that point really outweigh the stocks in net, it shows that there's an increase, when in reality we know that doesn't quite feel right. It's not actually what we're experiencing on the ground. It can be it's really all over the map, and often it's very case specific, really depends on the type of disaster event and the type of location you're looking at. Whether it happens in a continental area versus an island, probably a much different response level and capability. So what we really don't have very much insight into, though, is how disaster events affect places over time. And this is sort of, Andy said that my main focus is on energy and environmental and economic modeling, and this is really sort of my interest in this area. How do we isolate the impact of an environmental or disaster event as time passes? And Hawaii, in the case of Hurricane Iniki in 1992, offered an interesting opportunity to do this. There was recently a statistical technique that was formalized, the Journal of American Statistical Association, that allowed me to then say, okay, taking the other Hawaiian islands as a comparable unit of analysis, and this is what makes Hawaii very unique, and this disaster event unique to have insight into the long-term impact of disaster, because it hit one Hawaiian island and not the others. So we really do have an outside event that impacted one place and not other places that really are sort of comparable units of analysis. So I'm able to isolate Kauai and Kauai's economy in relationship to the other Hawaiian islands using this technique. And so what you see, I just pulled out a few indicators that I thought were particularly illustrative of the long-term impact. What you see here is the blue line is what I'm calling a synthetic Kauai, what Kauai's population in this case would have been if Iniki had never hit, based on using the other Hawaiian islands as that forecasting methodology. And then in the red line is what Kauai's population actually is. So we can see that prior to Iniki in 1992, we have a really good fit. And then it starts to diverge. And so by using this methodology, we can show that over time, the recovery, well, it's never quite recovered. From a population perspective, Kauai's lost about 12% of its population permanently. About 12% fewer people than would have been there had Iniki never occurred. And a lot of this is driven, sorry, can I get the next slide? A lot of this is driven by changes in employment. So back to this small business concept, right? If the businesses can't keep their doors open, in this case it was really about hotels. A lot of the major hotels, which are the major employers, so they're not small businesses, quite large businesses in fact, were shutting down rooms and didn't open. And a lot of this was driven by the hotel accommodations industry. But that's roughly about the similar 12% change over time that's also never fully recovered to where it would have been. And roughly translates similarly into personal income, which is kind of a measure of overall economic activity, overall well-being. But on a per capita basis, next slide, it didn't change very much. So this was really interesting to me. So what we found is that basically there's a large outmigration of the population of Kauai, and those who weathered the storm, so to speak, were really kind of just as well off. That on a per capita basis, they are about where they would have been otherwise. So what this really gives us a lot of insight into migration and the long-term impacts of disaster as a result of migration abilities, right? So if we think about a similar disaster type event happening in a Pacific Island nation where you don't have outmigration as easily as you do in Kauai, where people could come to Oahu or could go to the mainland, what have you, very easily, the impact would be a lot worse. So, we have about 20 years of data post-Iniki, and so we really can't, and this is a comparable unit of analysis, we really can get into what are those long-term impacts. And even in the, next slide, even though we've had, there was tremendous transfer of funds, sort of all these detailed support mechanisms that we've really gotten into today, the Kauai's never recovered in terms of total population, sort of total economic activity, total well-being. For those of you who are familiar with Kauai, I think in terms of having outmigration in a smaller economy, I think some people might have thought that was actually a good thing. So there are different ways to view this depending on your perspective. But clearly the economy has never fully recovered. And what I wanted to sort of my main message here is that when we start thinking about the long-term costs of recovery, they're really, quite extensive. They add up a lot more than the short-term costs. So the question is, what is normal? It's not necessarily sort of what you had before, right? But it's what you would have had without the disaster event. By other indicators in terms of it took Kauai about 7 to 8 years to get back to where it was before by most of these indicators. But clearly, 20 years later, we really never got back to what we would have had. So the long-term costs are really substantial, and we're thinking about disaster mitigation planning, thinking about various preparedness, all of what we've been talking about today. The long-term costs should also be considered, not just the short-term costs, which are substantial, but the long-term cost really adds a lot, greater dimension to this, a lot greater justification for mitigation and preparedness to stave that off. So that's my comments.
Thank you, McKenna. I think we have time for maybe one or two, if anyone in the audience has questions or comments on either the panel or Wendy or Jim. No one? Oh, all right.
In your spike, and maybe I just don't understand it, Hurricane Eva was right in there, and there's no reflection of that on these slides as in the continuance. Is that just because the data didn't consider that, or is it because I thought I would see some other jumps with other kinds of events?
Right. It's mainly No, it's not that it's the way that we developed the synthetic fly. Basically, we took the activity of the other Hawaiian Islands and historical relationship between fly and the other Hawaiian Islands, and then forecasted a future relationship based on that historical relationship, and then mapped that in comparison to what fly actually experienced. So, you're right, Eva should be in there, but because of the way we have the data, it's not reflected. What this is, it's sort of seeking out other than that noise of what else is going on that might have affected other places. So partly it's seeking out.
Thank you.
All right, well, I don't see anyone jumping up. Oh, we do have one more. There we go.
Hi, my name is Bart Abbott. I'm with the Center for Excellence. I'm going to attempt this question, but I took economics about 10 years ago, and it was just economics 101, so forgive me, McKenna. I noticed that the change in the economy after Hurricane Iniki, can we use that depression to reflect, I think it's an opportunity cost? In other words, that can inform planners when they're doing mitigation projections. In other words, this is the opportunity cost in real terms, and therefore in future planning, when we're taking mitigation into account, we can use that to adjust our cost-benefit analysis so that it's more accurate, and then as a result, we can justify higher levels of expenditure in mitigation activities and future development.
That's exactly right. A lot of times we think about the direct cost of Iniki is estimated at about $7 billion in 2010 dollars. So I inflated that number up to 2010 dollars. And if we just take that direct cost, $7 billion, but if we add in all of this indirect cost over time, that's usually, it's usually hidden. It's really hard to attribute changes in economic activity as time goes on, right? So if we can sort of add that up over time, I think you have better justification for spending on mitigation, preparedness, and whatnot. So that definitely, it would change the cost-benefit analysis tremendously. That's exactly right.
Let me add one thing here, because this is the first time I've seen McKenna's research on this stuff, and it's very interesting, and I've got all sorts of questions, which is the whole point of a good study. But it reminds me of something else that I wanted to mention that becomes really important, not just in thinking about disaster response and recovery, but also in terms of directed interventions into the economy, which is essentially what we're talking about in terms of the economic bounce back, is that you can't do it in a vacuum, and this is what McKenna's point is that you have to change it to, or think about what would have happened given the known changes that are happening to the economy as a whole, right? And so this is basically the business cycle, right? So economists do this all the time, right? We have recessions, we have expansions, and they define them very precisely, and we can agree with them or we cannot agree with them. But the point for disaster recovery and rebounding is that we need to be attentive to that and do either cyclical or counter-cyclical types of responses. And there's a fairly strong literature on this. And just to give you one example of the type of policy that might work or might not work given whether you're in a recession or an expansion is welfare policy, right? In the time when the reform to the welfare laws were done in 1995, it was an excellent way to get people out of dependence on state and federal resources into the larger economy. By the time 2001 rolled around, the economy was completely different, right? The jobs weren't available, so that policy was actually a terrible policy. And this is something that it's a slower trend, but this notion of big bumps and depressions in an underlying trend is a really important part of thinking about how an economy in a city can recover.
I'd like to add something. I think that what was being called an opportunity cost, you have to look at it very carefully a little bit. The change seems to be fundamentally related to the population change that occurred as a result of disaster. I think Katrina actually gives us a more modern example of a similar phenomena, that from the relocation of people after Katrina, the city shrank in size, essentially. Not only did it shrink in size, but it changed its demographic proportions as well. And both of those things are people are the underlying basis of an economy. So when you talk about opportunity costs, the changes in demographics, the changes in population size changes the market. And I think those are the kinds of impact that you're really seeing in this place.
Yeah, just to add a comment to what George said, I think the case of Katrina is a really, really interesting one, right? But it's also, the population there was already on a decline, right? And so Katrina clearly accelerated that effect. And I think that's something that Jim has also pointed out, that sort of whatever is the trend going on currently, a lot of times disaster events will accelerate that trend, whether it's related to closing small businesses' doors faster than the otherwise rate, or making some businesses go through an innovative process, right?
All right, well, thank you very much. I think we have a break now, yeah?